The chapel at Aldenmere held 300 candles, and not one of them flickered when the Earl of Westcombe rose from the front pew to say that he would not, after all, take Charlotte Brearley to wife. He said it with his back half-turned to her, which was its own kind of cruelty. The words pitched to carry to the rear of the nave, where the lesser families sat. Charlotte stood at the chancel step in a gown, the color of new cream, her gloved hands folded at her waist. And she did not move. The vicar's mouth opened and produced nothing. Somewhere behind her a woman gasped, then thought better of it, and pressed a handkerchief to her lips. The morning light came through the tall east window and laid a long pale bar across the stone floor, and Charlotte watched the dust turn slowly inside it, because to watch the dust was easier than to watch the man who had brought her here, and now declined to keep her. What the room did not know, what it could not have known, was that she had expected this for 11 days. You will see before the end that the not moving was not shock, but decision. That morning, though the room read only a jilted woman too stunned to weep, and the reading suited them, because a woman who weeps is a woman the room can manage. She had risen that morning before the maids. There had been a cup of tea on the window-sill of the small east room they had given her, the room with the cracked pane and the view of the kitchen yard, and she had drunk it cold rather than ring for more. She was a guest at Aldenmere only by the thinnest courtesy. Her father's estate at Marsh Brearley had gone to a cousin upon his death, by the entail that took no account of daughters, and the small portion left to her would not have kept a governess in gloves. The match with Westcombe had been arranged in the months before her father's body was cold, arranged by men in a study while she sat in a corridor with her hands in her lap, and she had agreed to it because there was nothing else in the world for her to agree to. She had told herself she did not mind. She had been telling herself that for nearly a year. To the families gathered at Aldenmere, she was the poor relation in borrowed lace. That was the phrase. The Dowager Countess of Westcombe, the Earl's mother, had used it first in a drawing-room in October, not knowing or not caring that the door stood open, the poor relation in borrowed lace. The lace had in fact been her mother's, the only thing of value the cousin had not thought to claim, and Charlotte had worn it to the betrothal dinner with her chin level, and the phrase had followed her down every corridor of the house since. She had not loved the Earl. She wished, standing now at the chancel step with 300 candles burning around her, that she could at least have hated him, for hatred would have given her something to hold. Thomas, Earl of Westcombe, was not, however, a man one could hate. He was a man one could only fail to reach. Tall, grave, his dark hair cut close, a jaw that did not soften even when he meant kindness. He had spoken to her, perhaps a dozen times across the whole of their engagement, and each time as though he were reading from a ledger. She had decided he was cold. The whole county had decided he was cold. It was the simplest decision available, and like most simple decisions, it was wrong, though she would not understand how wrong for some weeks yet. Now he stood in the aisle with his mother's hand on his sleeve, and he said the second cruel thing. He said that the engagement had been a misjudgment, that a man of his position owed his name a more suitable alliance, and that Miss Brearley would of course be provided for. As though she were a horse being put out to a softer pasture. The dowager's face, beneath its arrangement of gray curls and a diadem that caught the candlelight, wore the small, composed satisfaction of a woman watching a difficult sum come out even at last. Charlotte turned her head, then only her head, and looked at the long table that had been set at the side of the chancel for the wedding breakfast that would not now occur. On it stood the silver service, and a pot of tea kept warm beneath a quilted cozy, and a single cup already poured for her by some servant who had not been told the morning would go this way. She crossed to the table. The whole chapel watched her cross it. She lifted the cup and she drank her tea, unhurried to the last warm mouthful, while 300 people held their breath, and the Earl of Westcombe stood in the aisle and discovered that he did not know what to do with a woman who would not be managed. If you have ever been told, in a room full of people, that you are less than they had hoped, you know the particular silence that followed. Stay with me. What she did with that silence is the whole of this story. She set the cup down without a sound. She thanked the vicar for his trouble, her voice level and caring, and she walked the length of the nave alone, past the lesser families and the greater ones, past the dowager who did not trouble to lower her eyes, and out through the great doors into the grey November light. No one stopped her. No one quite knew how, and the Earl, who had rehearsed every word of his renunciation and not one word beyond it, watched the doors close on the only person in the chapel who had behaved with dignity, and felt the first cold edge of a mistake he could not yet name. To understand why a woman would drink her tea while the world ended, one must go back, not far, only to the spring before, when Charlotte had still had a father and a home, and a future she could describe in sentences. Marsh Braley was not a grand house. It was a low stone manor in a fold of the Cotswold Hills, with a walled garden her mother had planted and a library her father had filled past its shelves, and Charlotte had grown up in it, believing, as children do, that the things one loves are permanent. Her father, Sir Edmund Braley, was a scholar by temperament and a landowner by inheritance, better at the one than the other. And he had taught her Greek and the names of the stars, and how to read a man's character from the things he chose not to say. It was the last lesson that would matter most, though neither of them knew it. He died in March, without warning, of a failure of the heart, and the household discovered within a fortnight that the estate was entailed away from the female line to a second cousin in Bristol, who had never once visited and arrived now with a wife who measured the curtains. Charlotte was permitted to keep her mother's lace, her father's miniature, and a sum of £200. Everything else passed to the cousin, including the library, including the walled garden, including the small east-facing room that had been her own since girlhood. She left Marsh Braley on a wet morning in April with a single trunk, and she did not look back at the house, because she had already learned that looking back was a luxury she could not afford. The miniature she kept was of no great value to anyone but her. It was a small oval portrait of her mother, painted the year before her death, the face turned slightly as though someone had just spoken her name. Charlotte carried it in a flat case inside her traveling glove, against her palm, and in the months that followed, she developed the habit of pressing her thumb to the case when she needed to remember who she was. The room might change. The name on the door might change. The small weight against her palm, however, did not change, and she held to it. The match with Westcombe came through her father's old friend, the solicitor Mr. Rea. Hartley, who arranged it as he arranged everything, with a care that was almost tenderness and a complete failure to ask her what she wanted. The Earl needed a wife of good blood and modest expectation. Charlotte was of good blood, and her expectations could not have been more modest. The dowager had objected. Mr. Goomy. Hartley told her gently, but the Earl had overruled his mother, which Charlotte took at the time as evidence of the Earl's indifference, a man choosing the least troublesome option in a tedious matter. She would learn, far too late to be comfortable, that the Earl's overruling of his mother had been the first thing he ever did on her behalf. She arrived at Aldenmuir in September, in the brown stretch of the year, and the house received her the way a great house receives a poor relation, which is to say, with every courtesy and no warmth. The dowager met her in the long drawing-room beneath a portrait of the late Earl, and looked at her for a long moment, and said that she hoped Miss Braley would find the country quiet to her liking, and the way she said quiet made it clear she meant small. The poor relation in borrowed lace, Margot. The phrase had not yet been spoken aloud, but Charlotte heard it forming behind the dowager's careful smile, and she answered that she was fond of quiet, and she pressed her thumb to the miniature in her glove, and she did not let her face change. The Earl she met at dinner that first night, and he was exactly as she had been told, grave and silent and difficult to read. He sat at the head of the table and spoke when spoken to, and looked at her twice, both times when he believed she was not looking back. She catalogued him the way her father had taught her, by what he chose not to say, and found that he chose not to say a great deal, and concluded that there was a great deal of nothing to say. It was, she would later understand, precisely the wrong conclusion. The things Thomas Westcombe did not say were not absences. They were the most carefully guarded thing he owned. There was a child at Aldenmere. This Charlotte had not been told. On her second morning, she came upon a small boy of perhaps 6 years in the gallery, sitting on the floor beneath the windows with a wooden horse, and he looked up at her with the Earl's own grey eyes, and asked her without preamble whether she had come to be his mother. His name was Henry. He was the Earl's son, and there had been a countess once, 3 years dead, and no one in the house spoke of her, and the boy had been left to the care of a nurse who was kind, and a father who could not look at him without seeing the wife he had lost. Charlotte did not know any of this on the second morning. She knew only that a small boy had asked her a large question, and that the honest answer was complicated, and that the child deserved better than complication. So she sat down on the floor of the gallery in her good morning gown, and she asked him the horse's name, and she stayed there until the nurse came looking. The Earl saw it. She did not know he saw it. He had come to the gallery for some purpose. He forgot the moment. He reached the door, and he had stopped at the sight of the strange young woman sitting on the floor with his son, listening with evident seriousness to the saga of a wooden horse named Captain. And something in his chest had moved that he had spent 3 years keeping perfectly still. He withdrew before either of them saw him, yet he carried the image down the stairs and into his study, and could not put it down. And that night at dinner he looked at Charlotte 3 times, instead of twice, and once she almost caught him. This is the dramatic engine of the months that followed, and I will not pretend you cannot see it turning, for you can, and the pleasure is in the watching. The Earl noticed her. His body noticed her before his grief would permit his mind to. And Charlotte, who had decided he was cold, read each notice as its opposite, because her wound had told her a true thing once, that she was the least valuable object in any room, and a wound that has told one true thing will go on repeating it long after it has become a lie. The autumn deepened. The wedding was set for November, after the harvest, and the house filled slowly with the machinery of it. The seamstress and the flowers ordered from London, and the dowager's relentless small adjustments to a match she had not wanted and could not now prevent. The dowager fought the only way left to her, which was by reducing Charlotte by inches. A word here, a correction there. Miss Brearley would perhaps prefer the smaller dining room. Miss Brearley's people had been, had they not, of a more modest sort. The poor relation in borrowed lace, said aloud at last, in the yellow drawing-room, before 3 other ladies of the county, in a voice pitched to be overheard and then disclaimed. Charlotte was crossing the hall outside the open door when she heard it, and she stopped, and the ladies' laughter reached her, and she pressed her thumb to the miniature in her glove and walked on with her chin level, and her eyes dry, because the dowager would have given a great deal to see them otherwise. It was Henry, in the end, who undid her composure in the end, and undid it in the direction of strength rather than collapse. The boy had taken to her. He waited for her in the gallery in the mornings. He brought her the wooden horse and a book of fables he could not yet read, and demanded that she read them, which she did, in a low voice by the gallery windows. And the Earl, passing in the corridor below, learned to slow his step at a particular hour to hear it. One gray afternoon in late October the nurse fell ill, and the dowager, who considered the management of a 6-year-old beneath the dignity of the house, ordered the boy confined to the nursery with a footman at the door. Henry did not understand confinement. He understood only that no one had come, and by the time Charlotte found him, he had worked himself into the kind of terror that has no words, pressed into the corner of the nursery, with his face hot and his breath ragged, and the footman standing useless at the door because his orders did not extend to comfort. Charlotte sent the footman away. She sat down on the nursery floor and she gathered the boy against her, and she did not tell him to stop, because she had learned in her own first weeks of grief that to be told to stop is the loneliest instruction in the world. She held him until the worst of it passed. Then she told him about the stars, the names her father had taught her, the hunter and the bear and the 7 sisters, and she promised him that they were there, even in the daytime, even when he could not see them waiting behind the blue. The boy fell asleep against her with the wooden horse in his fist. And the Earl, who had been told by a frightened maid that his son was in a state and had come at a run with his coat unbuttoned, stopped in the nursery doorway for the second time in 2 months and watched a woman the county had decided was nothing hold the most precious thing he had and tell him about the stars. He did not withdraw this time. He came into the room and he knelt down, awkwardly, a tall man unused to the floor, and he looked at his sleeping son, and then at Charlotte, and he said, his voice low and not quite level, that he had not known the boy was frightened of being alone. Charlotte said that most people were, and that children only showed it more honestly. The Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come and sit by the fire. You are cold," which was a command, and which Charlotte heard as a command, and she rose and carried the boy to his bed and went where she was told, and she did not understand that the command had been the nearest thing to tenderness the man knew how to offer. She sat by the fire in the nursery, and the Earl stood at the window with his back to her, and neither of them spoke, and the not speaking was the first comfortable silence she had known since her father died. The wound he carried surfaced that night, though he did not name all of it. He told her, looking at the fire and not at her, that his wife had died of a fever 3 winters past, and that he had been in London when it took her, attending to a matter of business he could not now remember, and that he had returned to find her 2 days in the ground, and his son screaming in a nursery no one had thought to enter. He had built the silence in this house himself, he said, brick by brick, because silence was the only thing he had found he could control. He said it the way a man confesses to a crime. And Charlotte understood, sitting in the firelight with the man's sleeping son in the next room, that she had catalogued him entirely wrong. He was not cold. He was a man holding very still over a thing that had broken, the way one holds still over a cut, so as not to feel the depth of it. She had been doing the same for the better part of a year. She knew the posture from the inside. She should have understood then what was happening between them. The reader understands it. Charlotte's wound, however, spoke first and loudest, and her wound said, "He is grateful that you were kind to his son. Gratitude is not the same as choosing you. Do not be a fool twice in one lifetime." So she rose and bade him good night, and went to her cold room with the cracked pane, and she lay awake, and she pressed her thumb to the miniature, and she told herself that whatever had moved in her by the nursery fire was a thing she could not afford and would not name. What she did not know was that the dowager had stood in the corridor outside the nursery and heard her son's voice low and unguarded, in a way it had not been for 3 years, and had understood, with the swift accuracy of a woman defending the only thing she valued, that the match she had failed to prevent had become something far worse than an alliance of convenience. It had become a thing her son wanted. And a thing her son wanted, given to the poor relation in borrowed lace, was a verdict on the whole order of the world the dowager had spent her life maintaining. She went down to her own rooms, and she sat at her writing desk, and she began in her small, precise hand to take the engagement apart. The reader will forgive me one moment of stepping near. If you have stayed with Charlotte this far, you may sense as I do where this is bound. Hold the sense lightly. The dowager has not finished, and the worst is not yet done. The dowager's instrument was old and reliable, which was rank. There was a young woman in the county, Miss Augusta Fenwick, the daughter of a viscount, possessed of a fortune and of face, and a complete certainty that the world had been arranged for her convenience. She had been spoken of once as a possible match for Westcombe, before the Earl had inexplicably bound himself to a penniless scholar's daughter, and the dowager had cultivated her ever since the way one keeps a knife sharp against a need not yet arrived. Now, the need had arrived. The dowager invited the Fenwicks to Aldenmere for the fortnight before the wedding, ostensibly to honor the occasion, in fact, to set Augusta beside Charlotte in every room, and let the county draw the comparison the dowager intended. The diamonds beside the borrowed lace, the fortune beside the £200, the certain laughing girl beside the grave, quiet one. Augusta played her part without being told it was a part, for she believed every word of it. She was kind to Charlotte in the way the secure are kind to the precarious, which is to say, with a kindness that is itself a kind of cruelty. full of small assumptions about who would and would not be staying. She admired Charlotte's lace, and asked, with wide and guileless eyes, whether it was very old, and the room understood the question, and Charlotte said that it had been her mother's. And Augusta said how lovely. To keep such things even when one cannot keep anything else. The dowager across the room allowed herself the smallest motion of her fan, and the Earl watched. The Earl watched all of it, and said nothing, and Charlotte read his silence as consent. She watched him sit at dinner between his mother and Augusta Fenwick, and answer their conversation with the same grave economy he had once turned on her, and she felt the thing she had refused to name by the nursery fire wither in her chest, and she was almost glad of it, because a thing that has withered cannot be taken from you. She did not see, because her wound did not permit her to see, that the Earl answered Augusta in monosyllables and watched Charlotte across the candles whenever he believed himself unobserved. She did not see that he had gone to his mother privately and told her in a voice that ended the conversation that the wedding would proceed. She saw only the diamonds and the fortune and the certain girl, and she made ready, in the small, cold chamber of her own heart, to be set aside. It was in this stretch, 11 days before the wedding, that Charlotte made her decision. She made it alone, at night, by the cold window, with the miniature against her palm. She had been raised by a man who taught her to read character from the things people chose not to say, and she sat that night and read, at last, not the Earl, but the dowager, and what she read frightened her into a strange calm. The dowager would not let the wedding stand. The dowager had brought a more suitable girl into the house and arranged the comparison in every room, and the dowager was not a woman who arranged things she did not intend to use. The wedding would be stopped. The only question was the manner of the stopping, and Charlotte, who had been stopped before, who had been moved out of her own house by men in a study, decided that this time she would not be taken by surprise. She would not weep in front of them. Whatever they did to her, she would meet it on her feet, with her chin level, in possession of herself. It was the one thing they could not take, because it was the one thing that was wholly hers. So when the morning came, and the chapel filled, and the Earl rose in the aisle, and said the words his mother had taught him to say, Charlotte was not surprised. She had known for 11 days. And knowing, she had decided, and having decided, she drank her tea. The not moving the room had read, As shock was the stillness of a woman who has already grieved a thing and will not perform the grief again for an audience. She finished her tea, because finishing her tea was the last act of dignity available to her, in a building full of people who had decided she had none. And she would be damned, in the quiet private place where her father's lessons lived, before she would give them the weeping they had come to see. What she did not know, walking out through the great doors into the gray light, was that the Earl had not said the words his mother taught him. The dowager had done it herself. She had gone to her son the night before and told him a thing she had constructed with care over the fortnight, a thing about Charlotte and the solicitor, Mr. Dix. Hartley, an arrangement, a sum of money, a marriage, entered for gain and not for honor. She had documents, or what looked like documents. She had a letter, or what looked like a letter. And the Earl, who had learned 3 years before what it cost to be absent at the wrong moment, who carried the guilt of it like a stone in his coat, had been told that the woman he had let himself begin to want had been laughing at him from the start, and he had believed it for the length of one terrible night. Because a man already braced for the worst will believe the worst. When it is handed to him in his mother's certain voice, he had risen in the chapel that morning, not cold but in agony, and the agony had come out of him as coldness, because coldness was the only shape his pain had ever been allowed to take. He had said the cruel things because he could not bear to say the true ones, and he had watched her drink her tea and walk the length of the nave, and behave with a dignity no woman who had truly schemed against him could have summoned, and somewhere in the watching the dowager's certain construction had begun, very quietly, to come apart. It came apart fully that afternoon, in the Earl's study, when Mr. Hartley, the solicitor, who had been a guest at the wedding and had watched it collapse with mounting horror, demanded an audience and got it. Hartley was an old man and not a brave one, but he had loved Sir Edmund Brearley, and he had arranged this match in part out of that love, and he would not stand to see the dead man's daughter slandered. He had heard, from a footman, the shape of what the dowager had told the Earl, and he laid before the Earl, in plain terms, the truth, that there had been no arrangement, no sum, no scheme, that Charlotte Brearley had agreed to the match because she had nowhere else in the world to go, and had never once in his hearing spoken of the Earl with anything but a resigned and dignified resolve, that the documents the dowager had shown were either misread or made, and that the letter, if the Earl would trouble to look at it again, was in a hand that was not Charlotte's at all. The Earl looked at it again. The hand was not Charlotte's. He had seen her hand on the small notes she left with his son's books, and this was not it. The Earl sat very still in his study, in the posture Charlotte would have recognized the posture of a man holding still over a fresh cut, and he understood that he had done, in the chapel that morning, the precise thing he had spent 3 years swearing he would never do again. He had been told a comfortable lie, and he had failed, at the moment it mattered most, to look. He had been absent, not in London this time, but in the prison of his own braced grief, which came to the same thing. And the person who had paid for his absence was, once again, someone he had been given to protect. He did not rage. Charlotte would have been surprised to learn how little he raged. He rose, and he found his mother in the yellow drawing-room where she sat with the Fenwicks taking the satisfaction of a difficult sum come out even. And he asked the Fenwicks with perfect courtesy to excuse him a moment with the dowager. And when the door had closed, he told his mother, in a voice she had not heard from him since he was a grown man and she a younger woman, that she had made him break faith with an innocent person in front of 300 witnesses, that he knew now what she had done and how she had done it, and that he intended to undo it as publicly as it had been done. The dowager, who had expected gratitude, who had expected the relief of a man saved from a misalliance, sat with her fan motionless in her lap, and understood for the first time that she had miscalculated, not the strength of the match. Charlotte, meanwhile, had gone. Not far, for she had nowhere far to go, but she had taken her trunk and her miniature and the lace, and walked the 3 miles to the village inn at Aldenford, intending to wait there until the London coach came on Thursday, and then to disappear into the only future left to her, which was a governess's life, in some house where no one knew her name. She had not wept on the walk. She had been a little surprised to find that she could not, that the well of it seemed to have been drawn dry by the long calm of the past 11 days. She took a room at the inn under her mother's maiden name, and she sat by the small window with the miniature against her palm, and she watched the road, and she waited. The Earl came. At dusk. He came on foot, which a footman who saw it could not afterwards stop describing. The Earl of Westcombe walking the 3 miles to Aldenford alone in the November cold without his carriage, and he stood in the public room of the inn and asked the landlord for Miss Brearley. And the landlord said there was no Miss Brearley. And the Earl said, "Then the lady who took a room this afternoon, and the landlord, who was no fool, sent the boy up. She did not want to see him." She came down because she would not be the kind of woman who hid, and she stood in the public room of the inn with her chin level and her eyes dry, and waited for him to say whatever he had come to say. He looked, she thought, terrible. He looked like a man who had been carrying a stone for a long way. He told her without preamble that his mother had lied to him, that there had been a letter in a hand that was not hers, that he had believed it for one night and acted on it in the morning, and that there was no apology in the language adequate to what he had done. He did not offer her the apology that did not exist. He offered her instead the only thing he had, which was the truth, plainly, and the chance to refuse him to his face, which she said she had every right to do. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the public room hissed. Then she said the one sentence she could not have said 3 months before, the sentence her wound had kept locked because her wound did not believe it. She said that she had decided long ago that no one would ever choose her, and that she had built a whole life around the deciding, and that the trouble with his coming here was that it asked her to take the life apart. The Earl heard the thing inside the sentence, which was that she was afraid, not angry, and he did a thing he had not done since before his wife died. He crossed the room. He did not take her hand, for he had not earned it. He stood close enough that she had to look up, and he said, low and level and entirely without ceremony, that he had chosen her in a gallery in September watching her name, a wooden horse, and had been too much a coward to know it, and that he was done being a coward. And that if she would have him, he would say so in the same chapel and before the same people who had watched him fail her, so that the undoing would be as public as the wrong. She did not answer at once. She looked at him, and she pressed her thumb to the miniature against her palm, out of long habit, and she found to her surprise that she did not need it. She set the case down on the window-sill, and she said yes, not as a girl says it, breathless and grateful, but as a woman says it, who has weighed the thing and found it true, quietly, on her feet, in possession of herself. The second wedding was 3 weeks later, in the same chapel, with the same 300 candles, and this time the dowager was not in the front pew. She was there, for the Earl had not cast her out, that not being his way. But she sat among the lesser families at the rear of the nave, where she had once consigned the poor relation, and she watched her son marry the scholar's daughter with her own face arranged into the composure she had taught Charlotte to wear. And she understood that the order she had spent her life defending had not been overturned by rebellion, but by something quieter and more total, which was the discovery that her son's judgment of worth was better than her own. It is the particular humbling of the proud, to be corrected not by an enemy, but by a person they love, and the dowager bore it as well as such a thing can be borne, which is to say not gracefully, but completely. There was a moment before the vows that the county talked of for a year. The Earl, standing at the chancel step where 3 weeks before he had stood in the aisle and unmade them both, turned to the gathered families, the greater and the lesser, and he said a single sentence. He did not make a speech. He had learned, perhaps from her, that the shortest things carry the most weight. He said, I was wrong about her, and I will not be again. That was all. A dozen words, in a voice that carried to the rear of the nave where his mother sat. Then he turned back to Charlotte and took her hand, the first time he had taken it, and the vicar, who had recovered his voice in the intervening weeks, began. Henry stood at the front in a small coat that matched his father's, holding the wooden horse named Captain. And when the vows were done, he was the first to break the silence, calling out across the chapel in the clear, unembarrassed voice of a 6-year-old that now she was his mother, was she not? And the laughter that went through the nave was the first warm sound the building had held in years. And Charlotte, who had not wept at the cruelty, wept then a little at the kindness, because the body keeps its accounts honestly, even when the heart has learned to lie. They did not go to London for the season. The Earl had discovered in himself a distaste for the rooms in which verdicts were rendered, and Charlotte had no wish to be paraded as a vindication, for vindication was never what she had wanted. What she had wanted, though she had stopped letting herself say it, was a place where the weight against her palm was not the only permanent thing. They went instead to the Earl's smaller estate in the north, the one his wife had never seen, where the snow came early and lay long, and Charlotte planted a walled garden in the spring against the memory of another walled garden she had loved and lost. And the Earl learned to come in from the cold at a particular hour to hear her read to his son by the windows. On the first snowfall of that winter, Charlotte sat by the fire in the long room of the northern house, with Henry asleep against her side, and the Earl across the hearth, with a book he was not reading, watching her in the way he no longer troubled to hide. And she took her mother's miniature from its case and set it on the mantel where the firelight could reach it. The face turned slightly as though someone had just spoken her name. She had carried it against her palm for nearly 2 years, a private weight, a thing to hold when there was nothing else. She did not need to hold it now. She set it where it could be seen, in a house where she would not be moved out, beside a fire that was hers, and she let it rest. Outside the snow came down on a garden that would bloom in the spring, and inside the room was warm, and the boy slept, and the man watched her. And the small painted face turned toward the firelight as though at long last someone had spoken her name and she had turned to answer. If Charlotte's tea moved you, stay a moment in the warm of it before you go. That is all the story asks.